Imagine sitting down to watch a football match and just weeks later, hearing that the two countries are sending soldiers across the border. On June 26, 1969, in a packed stadium in Mexico City, a referee blew a whistle. An entire stadium erupted. Men wept, flags waved, and a football team celebrated a grueling extra-time victory. But as the players hugged on the pitch across the border, real tanks were already warming up their engines. Fighter jets were being loaded with live ammunition. Exactly less than 3 weeks later, these two neighboring countries would launch a full-scale, bloody invasion against each other. Thousands would die. Over 100,000 would lose everything, all because of a game of soccer. At least that's the story the world was told. But the terrifying truth is that this match didn't actually cause a war. It was something far worse. The match was a trap, and the governments on both sides were using 22 men chasing a leather ball to hide a massive, ticking demographic time bomb. To understand how a sport became a slaughter, we have to look at the map of Central America in 1969. Specifically, at two neighbors who couldn't have been more different, El Salvador and Honduras. El Salvador was the smallest country in the region, but it had a massive problem. It was hopelessly overpopulated. Worse, almost all the fertile land was brutally monopolized by just 14 ultra-wealthy families. The average Salvadoran peasant had no land, no job, and no future. Honduras, right next door, was 5 times larger, with plenty of open, untouched land. So, over the course of a few decades, a massive human migration happened. Over 300,000 Salvadorans quietly crossed the border. They cleared the Honduran jungles, built farms, started businesses, and raised families. For a while, it worked. But by the late 1960s, both countries were hitting a breaking point. In Honduras, the economy began to collapse. The military dictator, General Oswaldo López Arellano, was facing a massive wave of worker strikes and peasant protests. He needed a scapegoat, fast. So he looked at those 300,000 Salvadoran immigrants. The Honduran government launched a radical land reform law, but it wasn't designed to help the poor. It was designed to strip the Salvadorans of everything they owned. Practically overnight, thousands of Salvadorans were evicted from their homes, their land was seized, and they were forcibly pushed back toward the border. This put the Salvadoran government in an absolute panic. If 300,000 angry, landless, bankrupt refugees flooded back into their tiny country, it would trigger a bloody socialist revolution. The Salvadoran elites knew they were sitting on a powder keg. Both governments were desperate for a distraction. They needed something to make the people forget about starvation, land theft, and corruption. They needed a common enemy. And right on cue, the schedule for the 1970 World Cup qualifiers was released. Format was simple, a best-of-3 series. Game 1 was held on June 8, 1969, in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. The moment the Salvadoran team arrived at their hotel, they realized this wasn't going to be a normal game. All night long, thousands of Honduran fans surrounded the building. They threw rocks through the windows. They blew car horns, beat drums, and let off massive firecrackers. The Salvadoran players didn't sleep for a single second. The next day, exhausted and terrified, they lost to Honduras, 1-0. In El Salvador, watching their national team lose felt like a direct insult to their sovereignty. The media on both sides weaponized the loss, printing highly exaggerated stories of abuse. The tension was building. 1 week later, on June 15th, it was time for Game 2 in San Salvador. And this time it was war. The Salvadoran fans didn't just match the Hondurans' hostility, they multiplied it. They surrounded the Honduran team's hotel, throwing rotten eggs, dead animals, and bricks. They smashed every window in the building. The Honduran players had to be escorted to the stadium in armored military vehicles. Inside the stadium, things got downright dystopian. Instead of the Honduran national flag, the Salvadoran crowd hoisted a dirty, tattered rag up the flagpole. When the Honduran national anthem played, the noise of the crowd screaming obscenities was so loud it shook the stadium walls. Terrified for their lives, the Honduran team barely played. Their coach later admitted they were just glad to get out alive. El Salvador crushed them 3-0. But the violence didn't stop at the final whistle. Visiting Honduran fans were viciously attacked in the streets. Dozens of Honduran cars were burned to the ground. The players fled to the airport under a shower of rocks. Now the series was tied 1-1. The deciding match had to be played on neutral ground, Mexico City. But by this point, the game wasn't about the World Cup anymore. It was about survival. June 26, 1969. The Azteca Stadium. The atmosphere was so volatile that the Mexican government had to deploy thousands of heavily armed riot police just to separate the two fan bases. The match itself was a masterpiece of tension. El Salvador scored first. Honduras answered back. 90 minutes wasn't enough. It went to grueling extra time. Finally, in the 101st minute, a Salvadoran forward named Mauricio Pipo Rodriguez slipped past the defense and volleyed the ball into the net. El Salvador won 3-2. They were going to the World Cup. But while the players were shaking hands, the political machines were moving. On that exact same day, El Salvador officially severed all diplomatic ties with Honduras. They claimed the government of Honduras was committing genocide against Salvadoran migrants. The football matches had done exactly what the politicians wanted. They had whipped the populations into a frenzy of nationalist hatred. The people weren't protesting poverty anymore. They were demanding blood. On July 14, 1969, just 18 days after the final match, the silence was broken. The Salvadoran Air Force, using repurposed passenger planes with bombs taped to the floors, launched a surprise attack on Honduran airfields. Simultaneously, the Salvadoran army, heavily armed, marched across the border along the main highway. They caught Honduras completely off guard. The Salvadoran troops advanced rapidly, capturing several key Honduran towns. But Honduras wasn't defenseless. Their air force counterattacked, striking Salvadoran oil facilities and cutting off their fuel supply lines. 4 days, a brutal, chaotic war raged in the mud, villages, and skis. The international community watched in absolute disbelief as two nations tore each other apart over a conflict that the media dubbed the Soccer War. Finally, on July 18th, under massive pressure from the Organization of American States and threats of economic sanctions, El Salvador agreed to a ceasefire. The fighting had lasted just 100 hours, but the damage would last for generations. The 100-hour war left nearly 3,000 people dead, most of them innocent Honduran civilians. But the true tragedy was what happened next. El Salvador was forced to withdraw its troops, but they brought back something their economy couldn't handle. Over 130,000 Salvadoran refugees who had been brutally expelled from Honduras. The Salvadoran government's worst nightmare had come true. The powder keg they tried to distract everyone from. It finally exploded. The massive influx of landless, traumatized, and angry refugees completely broke the country's social fabric. Just 10 years later, the economic misery caused by this brief war sparked the Salvadoran Civil War, a brutal, horrific 12-year conflict that claimed the lives of over 75,000 people. The 1969 World Cup qualifier didn't start a war. It was used by desperate politicians to light a fuse they couldn't put out. But this isn't the only time a football match predicted a bloody national tragedy. In 1990, an entirely different match in Europe featured a famous flying kick that literally forecasted a brutal, decade-long revolution. To see how 90 minutes of football destroyed an entire European superpower, subscribe and turn on notifications.